Talking to people about Jesus can be really exciting, but we need to be careful too. How can we have positive, encouraging conversations with people who are investigating religion and Jesus and big questions? And how can we help people to explore their questions and perhaps come to discover Jesus for themselves? Ravi mentioned some basic principles. Answering the questioner, not just the question. Never assuming that the objection is purely intellectual. And remembering the authority of Scripture and the power of the Holy Spirit in those conversations. He also reminded us that the primary aim will always be to present the person of Jesus. In this lecture, Michael Ramsden builds on that foundation, emphasizing the importance of asking good questions.
I'm delighted to introduce to you Michael Ramsden, one of my longest-serving colleagues who joined our ranks fresh after his studies at Sheffield, where he not only did his studies in law and economics, but also lectured in moralist philosophers and in ethics. Michael Ramsden grew up in the Middle East and then moved back to his homeland of England, where he has been lecturing and teaching and is our full-time director, European director for the Zacharias Trust based at Oxford. You'll thoroughly enjoy Michael, not only in his content, but also in his humor. I consider him a dear friend and very knowledgeable in what he does. You'll enjoy him.
While I was still a research student in Sheffield, I was getting ready to head off for a particular speaking engagement and realised that just as I was about to head out the door, I was in desperate need of a haircut. Now, the road on which I lived, right at the end of it, there was a small hairdressing salon. So I simply walked down to the end of the road, walked into this building and said to this lady who was standing behind the counter, who was very tall and also obviously very pregnant, please can I have a haircut? And she produced an appointment book and she opened it and she produced a pen and then she said, when were you thinking of coming? And I said, well, now, looking at my watch. And so she looked at her book and she said, well, if we're very quick, I can squeeze you in. And I said, that's absolutely fine. I don't need anything fancy. The hair just needs to be short and it needs to be neat. So she walked me across and sat me in a chair, put an apron around me and then walked back to her desk and picked up a comb and scissors. And as she was walking back to stand behind me, she turned to the lady who was cutting hair next to me and said, you know, my business is doing so well, but there must be more to life than this. And then turned round to cut my hair. And given what she said, which intrigued me, I simply looked in the mirror and caught her eye and said, you know, what you say is very true. In life, we're not made happy by what we acquire, but by what we appreciate. And she stopped and looked at me in the mirror and said, what did you just say? And I said, well, in life, we're not made happy by what we acquire, but by what we appreciate. And she walked off. And she came back with a pad of paper and a pen. And she said, you couldn't say that one more time, could you? So I repeated it. She wrote it down. She put down the pad of paper and the pen. She picked up the comb and the scissors. And she said, I think there's some wisdom in that. So then again, just looking at her reflection in the mirror, I said, well, if you ask me, the trouble we have is not that we have nothing to be grateful for. It's rather we feel there's no one to be grateful to. And she put down her comb and scissors, picked up the pad and pen, and said, could you say that again for me? Now, in the end, it took her well over an hour to cut my hair. From there, we then moved into another discussion where she simply said, well, Michael, I'm bringing this baby into this world, and I'm so worried about bringing a baby into a world where there is so much evil in it. And I said to her, well, I know there's a lot of evil out there, but what about the evil that's in here? And she looked at me and she said, well, if there was a way to overcome evil in the human heart, that would be amazing. And I then said to her, well, it's interesting, isn't it? We feel there's this struggle within us. We often want to be better people, but we find ourselves unable. And she said, I know exactly what you mean. I would like to be a better person than I am, but I can't. And again, looking at her in the mirror, I said, what you're telling me is that there is like a power within you. And she said, I know, I feel like I need to be rescued from it. And I said, what you're telling me is you need a savior. And she looked at me and she said, ooh, that's a good word. And then I said, well, let me tell you how I think salvation may be possible. And we began to talk about who the person of Jesus Christ is. Is it possible for the power of sin to be broken in our life, as well as for the fact of sin to be forgiven in our lives? And she took notes on all of this. And towards the end of it, she said, well, what should I do about all of this? And I said, well, you can't sit on the fence forever. You're going to have to make a decision. What am I going to do with this person, Jesus Christ? Well, I finished my haircut. I went home. I told my wife what had happened. And we prayed for this lady. And then I thought, I'd really like to see her again, and wasn't sure how. So 2 weeks later, I went back. And as I walked in, she looked at me and said, Michael, I will cut your hair. I didn't even ask for a haircut. She sat me in the chair. This was now the shortest hair I've ever had in my whole life, by the way. And she picked up her comb and scissors and she looked at me and she said, do you remember the conversation we had just over 2 weeks ago? And I said, yeah, I sort of remember what you said. And then she said, well, I went home and I told my husband everything you told me. And I smiled, thinking this is going to be very interesting. And I said, well, what did your husband say? And a very puzzled expression came over her face. And she said, well, he told me that I was preaching at him. Well, of course she was preaching at him. They both get home from work. They sit down at the dinner table. She produces her notebook and starts off by saying, in life, you're not made happy by what you acquire, but by what you appreciate. It's not that you have nothing to be grateful for, you have no one to be grateful to. There's a lot of evil out there, but what about the evil in here? The Bible calls it sin, and there's like a power in our life, and we need to be rescued from it. We need a savior, and his name is Jesus. Now, what is the difference between these two conversations? Well, she was actually asking a question. When she said, there must be more to life than this, she's not so much making a statement, she's asking a question. Is there anything more to life than this? And I remember that day looking back, realizing that this is really what the Bible means when it talks about in 1 Peter chapter 3, always be prepared to give everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. Now, this verse, which is very often quoted by many other people, is a verse which is used by people interested in apologetics all over the world, where it says, but always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope. The word answer, translated there in 1 Peter 3, 15 and 16, is this Greek word from where we get the English word apologetic. And an apologetic is literally a sort of reasoned defense. It's actually a legal term, which is how you explain your faith to someone else. And this idea of what we would call conversational apologetics, of being in a position of how do we explain why we believe what we believe to other people who indeed may be very skeptical or have no belief of their own, how do we come and how do we actually do that? And that's what we're going to be doing in this session now. Now, in 1 Peter chapter 3, just to put that into its context, what we read is that this is a letter which was addressed to a church which lived at a very, very difficult time. As a matter of fact, when 1 Peter chapter 3 was written, when that command, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, was written, Christians could lose their liberty or even lose their life for trying to give an answer to such a question. And they're being told, look, even though you may feel that you're under threat, and even though people may come after you, find a way with gentleness and respect to be vocal, to speak up for what you believe, but make sure you do this with gentleness and respect. In other words, your circumstances never excuse not actually doing this. Number two, if you read that letter very carefully, especially in the beginning part of it, you realize that this is a very practical book. This is a very practical letter to Christians, telling them how they should live. And the assumption which runs all the way through this is, look, live holy lives. If you go back to 1 Peter 3 verse 8, it says, do not repay evil for evil or insult with insult, but with a blessing. And what it's saying is, look, make sure you live differently. Jesus Christ changes lives. Make sure that this changed life, this new life he has given you, is evident to other people, and they will ask you questions. Now, sometimes Christians say to me, but Michael, people don't ask me questions, and there's a very difficult response to such a statement coming from a Christian, and it's this. Well, what does your life look like? If we go round telling people that Jesus Christ is able to radically change people's lives so their lives look and taste differently, then we should not be surprised when people expect to see different lives. do our lives actually call forth questions? So not only was this a command addressed to a church which was very difficult to answer, it's also addressed in the context of holiness, that the Christian's life should look different, and this should prompt people to ask the question, well, why? Why do you live that way? Why do you act that way? Why don't you respond angrily to those who might respond angrily to you? And we have to take this to heart. And if, as a church, if we are now living in a culture where the culture has no more questions of the church itself, we have to take a hard look at ourselves and say, well, how are we living? Now, the third point, just before getting into the specifics of this, is that we are told that before we seek to give an answer to others, we must first make sure that Jesus Christ is Lord of our hearts. In your heart, set apart Christ as Lord, in 1 Peter 3:15. In other words, this whole process of trying to answer people's questions is part of a spiritual struggle, it's part of a spiritual battle, and in order to engage effectively in it, we have to make sure that that issue of Christ's lordship in our own hearts has finally been settled. And of course, it means, therefore, that if the starting place is, well, in your heart set apart Christ as Lord, and always be prepared to do this, that this is a command that is given to the church, not to a group of specialists, not to a group of people who are very fascinated by philosophical theology or theological philosophy, but this is a general expectation that the average member of the church, when asked, well, why do you believe that, should be able to say, well, this is why. And the question is, can we do it? How do we do it? Now, having made these introductory points, let's just look very carefully at this almost phrase by phrase to see what's been envisioned here in the book of 1 Peter when it comes to giving an apologetic. And what does it mean to be equipped as a conversational apologist? Well, we first of all read, as we said, in your heart set apart Christ as Lord. That's the first thing that we have to make sure is true. And then secondly, always be prepared. Now that Greek word, always be prepared, carries with it the idea of getting fit. Now I've always dreamed of being fit. I remember once exercising, for several weeks in order to emulate one of my heroes of the screen, who was a man by the name of Arnold Schwarzenegger, someone I've always wanted to look like. And at the end of several weeks of hard exercise, I stood in front of the mirror and there was no discernible difference. Now, getting fit is actually quite difficult. It's very challenging. And the hard thing about getting fit is not just that once you've got fit, you can then relax because you've achieved it and you keep it forever. Once you've achieved fitness in your life, you have to keep working at it, otherwise you lose it. So when it says always be prepared, that word there is giving us a clue that we're about to be given something that's going to take continual effort and continual hard work. And the question is, do we care enough about the world in which we live and also about what we think and what we believe to actually put in the effort to be in a place where we can actually do this? Are you prepared? Secondly, always be prepared to give an answer. Now that word comes from this Greek word apologia, where we get the English word apologetic from. And it means to be able to give a reasoned, legal answer, explanation. But that term doesn't just simply mean that we should be ready to give answers to other people's questions. It also encapsulates the idea of being able to ask questions to other people's answers, or even to answer a question with a question itself. And this is what we see happen supremely in the life of Jesus Christ. Just after I became a Christian, having lived a lot of my childhood in Saudi Arabia, I can remember becoming a Christian, picking up a Bible, reading through the Gospels, and being very surprised. Now, as a child, I loved listening to the BBC World Service, and one of the things I would often do is interview world leaders and politicians. But the annoying thing was that every time they were asked a question, they would answer a different one. And here I was, as a new Christian, reading through the 4 Gospels, and people come to Jesus Christ and they ask him difficult questions, and I'm thinking, oh no, is he answering their question? Maybe he's answering a different question. He's just like all the other politicians and world leaders out there. Now, after very careful study over very many years, I realized that's not what Jesus Christ ever did. What was going on? Well, we can see this thing about the fact that apologetics isn't just simply about giving answers to other people's questions, but also questioning other people's answers, or even questioning the question itself in the life of Jesus Christ. And let's just look at why asking questions is so important. Because one of the problems we have as a church is that we're very often told, well, this is what the answer is, and you should speak it. But as Francis Schaeffer said, we don't know what the questions are. And so the answers don't seem to be connecting. And asking questions is one of the ways to, therefore, both understand the culture we're in and get to the heart of it. So what does asking a question do? Well, firstly, asking questions forces people to open up within their general assumptions. There are some assumptions that people make which are true for all people at all times in almost all cultures. So let me give you an example. Imagine you were to go onto the streets of the city in which you live and say to someone, just stop the people at random and say, if there is a heaven, so even an atheist could answer, if there were such a place, how would you get there? And what will most people say? Well, the overwhelming majority will say, be good. Be a good person. If you're a good person and you're trying hard, then you're going to go. Now, it's very interesting because Jesus Christ was actually asked that question in Luke 18:18. Someone came to him and said, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus looks at them and says, why do you call me good? Now that's a great question. Why is someone good? What makes someone good? Now he gives a very interesting answer, which is an answer we all need to take to heart, which is this: all good people will go to heaven. There's no doubt about that. So the question is, well, who's good? And then having asked the question, Jesus then answers the question. Only God alone is good. Now let's run all of that together. If you have to be good to go to heaven, and only God is good, who is going? And the answer is no one, apart from God. In other words, your application to join the Trinity has just been refused. You do not meet minimum entry requirements. Now sometimes people struggle with this because we like to think that we're basically, well, perfect people. Now, if you are watching this and you are convinced that you are perfect, there may be only one way out of that state of self-deception. You're going to have to get married. If you're in a close relationship, the faults which you have immediately come to light. Jesus Christ stood in front of his closest friends and his fiercest critics and said, who here convinces me of any sin? Who here can prove I've done anything wrong? There was silence. Now, if I were to stand in front of my closest friends and my fiercest critics and say, hey, who here can prove I've done anything wrong? Silence would not be the response. If my wife was in the room, the first response would be laughter. But by asking the question, Jesus is making us ask, well, actually, maybe we're not quite as good as we think we are. And this then raises a very important question, which is linked with why we need to ask questions like this. Because if a Christian stands in front of an audience and says, look, I know I'm going to heaven, that sounds incredibly arrogant. What makes you think you're so right in what you think and in how you act? How can you claim such moral perfection? And the answer is actually, no, I'm not saying that I'm better than everybody else or that I've achieved moral perfection. What we're talking about here is forgiveness, that God is able to forgive. And so it's not a question of being good and being perfect, but it's a question of the fact that we can be forgiven. Now, the second thing that asking questions does is it not only forces people to open up within their general assumptions, it also forces them to open up within cultural assumptions. Now, some assumptions are made and they are specific to certain cultures. Once you step outside of that culture, that assumption no longer holds. So let's give another biblical example. In Matthew 22:15, people come to Jesus and they say, good teacher, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, that would appear to be a very simple question. Should we pay our taxes? All churches have always taught, regardless of your government, yes, pay your taxes. So why is this question a trap? Now, we know the question is a trap because in Matthew 22:15 it says, and wanting to trap him in his words, so there's the clue, okay, this question is a trap, they came to Jesus and asked this question. And we realize that the question is actually very charged. How do we know that? Well, for two reasons. Firstly, if you read that story very carefully, the people who want this question asked don't ask it themselves. It's too politically explosive. Instead, they get a group of their young men, their young disciples together, and they coach them and they say, we want you to go and ask this question. So they send them off to go and ask the question on their behalf. They don't need to be there. And number two, that they send the Herodians with them. In other words, they send the government officials with these young men to ask Jesus Christ this question. And when they come and ask the question, they give it a great build-up. Jesus, we know you are a man of integrity, they say. You teach the way of truth as it really is. You aren't swayed by other people. You pay no attention to who they are. Now, that's very complimentary. And then they ask the question, should we pay our taxes or not? Now, having said the question is a trap, and having the government now listen to Jesus' answer, what is the trap? Well, the people asking the question are God's chosen people, the Jews. But the Jews are being oppressed by a Roman army. If you pay your taxes, you're financing the oppression of God's people. But that would be wrong, would it not? But if you don't pay your taxes, well, you can be imprisoned or executed. No taxes, no life. Now do you see the beauty of this? Jesus has been thoroughly uncompromising in his message. If he looks at them and says, no, don't morally compromise, don't pay your taxes, the government are there, Jesus will be arrested, and then he disappears. Their problem has gone. They don't have to think what they need to do with Jesus. If, however, Jesus says, pay your taxes, they will say, ha, you too are prepared to morally compromise in order to save your own skin. Now here's the brilliancy of the question. Now what Jesus does, therefore, is he has to speak now into this assumption and bring clarity. He says, bring me a coin. They bring a coin, and then he asks two questions. Whose head is this on the coin, and whose inscription? Well, Caesar's, they reply. And then Jesus says, fine, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. In other words, yes, pay your taxes. Is this Caesar's? Give it to Caesar. Okay, but holiness is all about giving to God what is God's. And now Jesus has had to both speak into the culture, to open up a cultural assumption, and now he's done a third thing as well, which is he has exposed faulty logic. And the third thing that asking questions does is it can help expose faulty logic. Now, I used to teach logic at university. I've often maintained that teaching logic is the secular equivalent of speaking in tongues. The difference is that when you teach logic, even angels may not understand what you are saying. What is going on here? What is the faulty logic? Well, there's a form of faulty logic where you take two separate issues and you join them together. When I was 7 years old living in the Middle East, I can remember one day in a playground being just coming into a question in my mind. I don't know where it came from, I don't know if I read it somewhere else, but this question popped into my mind. And for the next 2 weeks, I had a lot of fun using this question amongst my friends. And during a break, I'd go into the playground, I'd find 2 or 3 people playing together, I'd pick out one of them and I would say, can I ask you a yes or no question? And of course they'd say, that's fine. And I'll say, fine. Does your mother know you are stupid? Now you see the problem with the question. If they say yes, they are stupid, their mother knows. If they say no, they're stupid, their mother doesn't know. And if they say I don't know, they're so stupid they don't understand the question. Now, what is wrong with the question? Well, the question is constructed in such a way as to force you into this error. You can't give a yes or no answer to that question. What you want to do is to say, no, I am not stupid, and yes, my mother knows that I am not stupid, but that option isn't given to you. But by asking the question, Jesus is exposing this faulty logic. He is separating two issues that have been joined together. And this happens a lot in our culture. Now, this then leads to the fourth thing that asking questions does, because what it also does is it helps clarify the issue. Giving the right answer to the wrong question is always wrong. Giving the right answer to the wrong question is always wrong. A modern example of this might be, imagine you're in a cafe. You're talking with a friend and they look at you and they say, well, you're one of these crazy Christians, aren't you? And you say yes. And as they ask that question, there's just a silence around you. And now all of the people at their tables turn to face you as you say, well, yes, I am. And they go, fine, I want to ask you this question. Do you think abortion is right or wrong? Now you hear all the chairs turning. Everyone's now looking at you and they're expecting you to answer this question. And you're now going to speak. What are you going to say? Well, what some Christians might say is, well, I'm going to say, well, yes, of course, this is wrong. This is the answer to the question. But what is the question? In the world's eyes, this question is all about choice. Okay, what freedoms do we have, and don't we have the freedoms to make these choices? So, if you then say, yes, what you're saying is, I want to take away people's choices. Now imagine at that point, you could go to everyone in the cafe who's listening to this conversation taking place, give them all a blank piece of paper and say, write down on this piece of paper what you think about me. What words will they use to describe you? And the answer is, nothing flattering at all. Then imagine you say, well, actually, it's not me who thinks this, it's God. Does that help? Well, imagine again, you could go back into the cafe, give everyone a piece of paper and say, what words would you use to describe God? And the answer is, well, the issue is about choice. He wants to take it away from us. He's a dictator. He's a tyrant. He's an oppressor. He's a fascist. Now, where in all of the Bible do you read those words being used to describe God? If someone asks you a question, and by giving what you think is a simple answer, people will conclude the opposite about the nature of the Christian faith and the nature of the Christian God, there is normally something wrong with the question itself. Giving the right answer to the wrong question is always wrong. You're going to have to clarify the issue. Okay? What is this issue actually about? Is it about life and how we understand that, in which case what gives anyone the right to end it? Or is it really first and foremost about choice? But until you clarify the issue, it's impossible to give a meaningful answer, which is the fourth thing, as I said, that asking questions does. Now, the fifth thing that asking questions does is it helps expose people's motives. In Luke chapter 20, Jesus says, people come to Jesus and they say, by whose authority are you doing all of these things? And Jesus looks at them and says, I will answer you if you will answer me. John the Baptist, whose authority did he have? And now this group of religious VIPs that have come to ask Jesus Christ this difficult question, they all retreat. And they get into a little huddle and they say to themselves, what shall we do? If we say John the Baptist had authority from heaven, the people will say, why didn't you listen to him? But if we say John the Baptist had authority from men, the people will say to us, will reject us because they believe John the Baptist had authority from heaven. So they turn around and they go back to Jesus and they say, we don't know. Now, is it true? Is it true that they think they don't know? No, they think they do know, but they're wrong. Now, Jesus' response is fascinating. He doesn't say, I don't know either. He looks at them and says, you will not answer me, I will not answer you. And here he is exposing their motive, their will behind the question. They are not interested in hearing what he has to say. Now, we have to be very, very careful with this because you can get it horribly wrong. I can remember once, many, many years ago now, being on a university panel, being asked the question by somebody, well, who created God then? And I thought they were trying to be clever. So I gave a very, very brief answer, and I said, I don't understand your question. So they repeated it. I said, I still don't understand the question. They looked worried and they said, well, why not? And I said, well, you're asking the question about God, who by definition is eternal. He's always existed. There was never a time he didn't exist. But when you say who created him, you're assuming there was a time he didn't exist and was brought into existence. So what you're saying is, when did the God who's always existed not exist and have to be brought into existence? The question at that point doesn't make sense grammatically. Now, interestingly, at the end of the meeting, this young guy came up to me, thanked me, and became a Christian at the end of it. This question had terrorized him for years. So I thought I was trying to basically help him see, hey, are you playing games here, or are you really interested in the truth? But actually he was interested in the truth, so we have to be very, very careful with that one. Now, the other thing that asking questions does is it helps expose contradictions. And that's a much more gentle way of exposing someone's contradictions than simply telling them that they're wrong. Let's take the statement that people sometimes say, look, there's really no such thing as truth. Now, you can give an answer to that, which basically says, well, why do you say that? And they might say, well, that's what I believe. And you say, well, really? Are you telling me it's true that there's no such thing as truth? And you're now trying to ask them a question. There's no such thing as truth. Is that true? I remember speaking to a group of people in this country and one of them saying, you can never be certain of anything. And I said, really, you're certain about that? I remember him sitting back in his chair and laughing. A question which is asked well and in the right spirit can help somebody see where they're going wrong in their logic. And very lastly, asking questions ensures a conversation. And there's one thing that Jesus Christ did all the way through the Gospels, which is he spent a lot of time talking to people, engaging with them as individuals. So this command, always be prepared to give an answer, is something that anticipates continual hard work and means that we need to be thinking about the culture we're in and what kinds of questions should we be asking. Now it goes on. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you. Now, we said earlier that many people are not asking questions anymore. Now, one of the reasons for this is, as Christians, we're struggling with something which is very, very big. When many Christians are asked, why are you a Christian? They respond by saying how they became a Christian. But why you are a Christian is not the same as how you became one. And those two answers aren't the same. Let's suppose someone says, why are you a Christian? And you say, how? Well, I met these nice Christians, they were answering my questions, they invited me to my church, I went away with them, and then I became a Christian. Now, what does that sound like? Well, to many people, that sounds like a combination of two things, brainwashing and chance. You happen to meet those people. If you met Buddhists, you would have become a Buddhist that day. If you met Muslims, you would have become a Muslim that day. And secondly, they successfully convinced you to believe something that wasn't true. Now, is that why people are Christians? It's just happenstance and brainwashing successfully mixed together. Now, the reason why we are a Christian is a question about truth. Well, is this real? And so the question that we have to ask ourselves as Christians is, well, can we answer the question why? Or can we simply tell the story how? How we became a Christian is very powerful and a very important thing that we can share with other people. But when they say why, can we say why? Are you able to do it? It takes continual hard work. In your heart set apart Christ as Lord, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason. So very briefly, let's just say something about that. Here, what Peter is saying is, look, the Christian gospel is not a superstition. It's not like saying, hey, I believe in Jesus, that brings me good luck, in the same way you think cats bring you bad luck. Superstitions are really ultimately cannot be justified in a deep and fundamental way. But the Christian faith, there are reasons. There is a reason why all of this happened. There is a reason why God reveals himself in the person of Christ. There is a reason why he died on the cross. Can we give those reasons? Can we actually make it make sense to somebody? So they go, yeah, that makes sense. I see where you're going. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. Now, the reason why Christians have hope is because of the person of Jesus Christ, his life, his death, his resurrection, his coming again. That's why we have hope. In that sense, all of our apologetics has to flow to and flow from the cross. Why does that make a difference to this world? Why should his death 2,000 years ago have anything to do with me today? That's not an unreasonable question. And why does it bring hope? What is the basis for hope it brings? And let's just make one side note here. Does it bring us hope? And do we claim we have hope because we can answer all questions? Well, that would be a very brave person who said that, because I think most Christians would say there are things that they struggle to understand. So we don't have hope because we feel we've got everything figured out. The question is why, and how is that connected to the person of Christ and to the cross of Christ? Can we give the reason for the hope? And then lastly, we have to do this with gentleness, respect, keeping a clear conscience. There was a story told about Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister, which I have no idea is true, almost certainly apocryphal, at least I hope so. But the story is told that she was debating with one of her cabinet ministers, a very gentle man who was once described as being the type of character as such that when you were debating with him, you felt you were being ravished by a dead sheep. So very, very soft, gentle person. And the story came that he came to open his mouth in a cabinet meeting to disagree with her, and she looked at him and said, "When I want your opinion, I will give it to you." Now, I have no idea if that is true, and sometimes we find those stories amusing to tell. But if that thing happens to us personally, we find ourselves very offended by it. We have to treat people with gentleness. We have to do this with respect, where we actually respect the person who's asking the question and disagreeing with what we might want to say, and conduct ourselves in a manner such that if they were to slander us for saying, well, this person is very arrogant, very rude, very opinionated, that they should feel ashamed of it. It doesn't say they will feel ashamed, but they should feel ashamed. And that we should do all of this with a clear conscience. In other words, we don't lie. When we don't know answers to questions, we say, gosh, you know what, I'm not sure. Can I look that up? Can I look into that for you? Let me go away and just see, and think about that for a while and get back to you. And we do all of this because we want to see people's lives changed. Are we able to give an answer to the question why? Have we set apart Christ as Lord in our hearts, and are we able to give an answer to those who are asking us for the reason for the hope that we have? And when we do so, are we doing so with gentleness, respect, and keeping a clear conscience? This is what apologetics is about, and this is what this course is helping you wrestle with, and hopefully will help equip you to actually do so.